It's a pleasure to be here at the American Library. It's always a pleasure to be here at the American Library. It's a particular pleasure here to be here with Edward Chisholm.
Hesitated.
Well, yeah. It's a pleasure, sort of. Yeah. It's a joy, even. I pause and hesitate a lot. So you'll kind of you'll be annoyed. You'll be annoyed by that very soon. We're going to be in conversation and in celebration of this book, A Waiter in Paris. It's a book I like. You'll be pleased to know. It's a book that I was incredibly excited about before it came out, and I wasn't disappointed by it. Which is rare. The enjoyment matched the original excitement, which is good. I devoured it. It's for those of us that haven't read it. It's a memoir. It's a memoir about moving to Paris and trying to make a success of living in Paris. But don't let that put you off. Because there are a lot of books that do that. But this isn't Emily in Paris. This isn't Edward.
It's Edward in Paris.
In Paris, but this isn't that type of world. This is a book that is elegantly written. This is a book that is readable, that is entertaining, but it's also a difficult book in many ways. And what I mean by that is it's a book that's gritty. It's a book that is journalistically investigative. I've described it as investigative journalism with the body. It's an exploration of what Lucy Sant described as the other side of Paris. It's the anti-chocolate box, sparkling Eiffel Tower veneer of the city. It's a book about restaurants. It's not a book about food. But it's also a book about money, about class, about power, about the spectacular nature of all of that stuff. It's also a book that talks about race and gender and politics and contemporary French society in a way that might not be immediately obvious when you're browsing through a copy. Edward Chisholm, hello.
Hello. I think we're done.
That's it. Thank you very much.
Covered all the topics.
Can you tell us how it all came about?
Good question. Well, how did I write the book?
Yeah.
Well, I'd been trying to write or get published for quite some time, and I don't know if he's here, Simon. Ah, yes, there we go, special guest, who I'd done some research for, and Simon had said, "Why don't you write about your restaurant experiences?" And it's funny because when you're looking for stories, anything seems like a possible story, and I suddenly realised, actually I could turn the camera, if you like, towards myself and write about my own experience or the other people's. And so that was kind of the genesis, thanks to Simon. So Simon's here, special. Thanks to him, it's all happened, really.
And this is a book that speaks of your time working in restaurants. Can you give a little flavour about how you kind of emerged into the restaurant world and how you ended up waiting?
Yeah, so I never intended to work in a restaurant. I'd never worked in a restaurant before as well. And so I think, when I arrived, I had sort of aspirations to get like a real job, a career job, whatever that means. I'm still not sure. But I quickly realized because I didn't speak French, I didn't know anybody, I couldn't get a job. And so for me, the obvious thing to do was like, well, there's lots of restaurants, I'll get a job. How hard can it be to get a job in a restaurant? And it turns out it's quite difficult, especially if you don't speak French, obviously. So I would just walk up and down streets. I had a little pocket map of Paris, and I'd just go down, and it was genuinely humiliating because you'd walk into restaurants and basically sort of begin a monologue about looking for a job, and you'd get sort of knocked back, the usual shrugs, the indifference and stuff. But little by little, over like a matter of weeks, I sort of became quite good at this one monologue. So if you didn't know me and we didn't deviate from me looking for a job, you thought I spoke French.
Had you been coached?
No, it was just me. So like every like it was like each restaurant was like a skirmish. So you always get like one sentence further, and you'd come back, and then afterwards I have a dictionary. I'd be like, how do I say this? How do I say this? And so like each time I go in, so by the time I get to this point, and I was about to give up, I was like, this is it. I'm never going to get a job in a restaurant. You think that how hard is it to be a waiter? And just nobody would give me a chance. And by this point in the book, yeah, I think I came across as like quite proficient French speaker, which is far from the truth. If you ask me anything about, have you worked in a restaurant, outside of that, I wouldn't have been able to answer. It took me a long time to be able to answer.
And you make a decision early on in this book, and there's a fantastic moment in the opening pages that for me is the moment when this book becomes something more than just your kind of run-of-the-mill moving to Paris and making it memoir. And you kind of make a distinction between what it means to live in Paris, or what it means to really live in Paris. And you talk about the expat communities, and you talk about people who are kind of here but not really here, and some you're quite disparaging about, writing blog posts about how to date a Frenchman and what have you. Right? But you made that conscious decision not to write blog posts about dating Frenchmen, right? You
used to nom de plume, so you'll never find them.
Yeah, but you actually made the decision to kind of go all in, and it's like you're in with your whole self.
Yeah, I think I wanted to sort of wrong or right as well. I've been a bit lazy at school, very lazy, and I hadn't obviously learned to speak a language or anything. And I knew that if I was going to do this, I had to do it. Like, I had to go all out, all in, sort of gonzo, I guess, and just live it. And so purposely, it's quite easy to fall in, I think, with English-speaking people, or from wherever you're from. And I just wanted to reject that because I felt like I wasn't really going to get what I was looking for from Paris. I wasn't really sure what that was, maybe, but I knew I wanted to get to sort of the heart of what the city was or what the experience was. And in order to do that, I needed to not be encumbered by the kind of expat experience, which felt a bit like, it felt very superficial. Like, first of all, not even speaking the language. I didn't want to be that person. And it's nice to be able to, I find when you're communicating with people, just in sort of general exchanges in the street and stuff, you learn quite a lot. So for me, it was very much like I had to go straight in, like, and just do the whole thing.
And was there always a book in the back of your mind?
Yeah, but not this book. So I was probably, there's some terrible stuff in my drawer still. But I had no intention of writing a book about waiters, Paris, restaurants, anything. I mean, at one point, I think I had it as a setting for a book, but I was going to write a fiction book about it. And so that's the thing, like, it was kind of strange then revisiting all these experiences and sort of orchestrating it into a narrative, which is in the book, because you're just sort of living it at the time, and you never think your life is, I've not personally had that, but now I'm always on the case, like, looking at my life as like a book. No. But like, it was strange to suddenly realize that actually all the things I've been living could make a book, or allow me to say something about something, I guess. So yeah, it wasn't intentional. Yeah,
and you stumble across you can tell us how you encountered le Bistrot de la Seine, which is the name that this restaurant has and will be exclusively called,
of course,
throughout the purposes of our conversations.
Which no longer exists.
Le Bistrot de la Seine. And can you give us an idea about how you stumbled upon this place and what your impressions were, and perhaps the type of institution it was? I think it's helpful to give our listeners a feel for the type of establishment it is as well.
Yeah, so obviously Paris has a whole sort of like plethora of eating establishments, from your kind of corner local bistro to sort of fancy Michelin star places. And if you're me or somebody who's never worked in a restaurant, you're not really welcome in either of those two extreme ends. I can't work in a Thai restaurant because I don't speak Thai and all this kind of stuff. So this place was like, it's kind of the classic traditional restaurant, but a little bit more fashion, a little bit more stylish, I guess. I say fashion in sort of very vacuous, shallow sense of the word. And so I think that allowed me, and that was what was fortunate, because the guy who was the director of the establishment, he thought like it was kind of chic, probably in a kind of sadistic kind of way, to have an English waiter. And so that's what sort of allowed me to get in the door, because I think he was just, it's cool, English waiter, we'll give him a chance. I say waiter, I told him I had a lot of waiting experience, but I obviously didn't. So then the fun began.
Yeah, and in terms of the size of this place and the layout of this place, I think it's kind of really helpful to kind of paint a picture of what we're talking about here, because we're not talking about a kind of 60-seater bistro.
No. On the contrary, yeah. So a huge outdoor area and then a huge indoor area. So there was, how many covers? We're doing hundreds and hundreds of covers per seating, basically. So it was big. It was a busy place. It's always busy. Lunch and dinner all of the week. There was never like any respite. Especially Sunday was the worst day, non-stop.
And in terms of initially, your experiences here, you're not waiting tables, right?
No. I think they sussed that I was not like waiter material, mainly because I was sort of deaf, dumb, and mute, and I just sort of stand there looking at people and trying to pick up like primary verbs like aller or like prendre, and I'd be like, okay, and because you pick it up quite quickly. I guess we'll talk about that later. But if someone's pointing at a dirty table, you're like, débarrassé. I learned that pretty quickly. It was like just take stuff off the table. So yeah, they sort of made me a runner, which is like a much less glamorous post than a waiter, which is basically, as the name suggests, to run between the kitchen and the tables with either food that's ready or the dirty plates. But you'll kind of become the like whipping boy of all the waiters, and if anything goes wrong, weirdly, it's your fault, which it never was, right?
The kind of sheer chutzpah of this kind of is kind of sinking in for me a little bit, because there you are, without the language, without really knowing what you're doing, and you're there kind of being thrown into 16-hour shifts, 14-hour shifts on a daily basis. And at what moment do you think, hang on, they're going to work this out in a minute? Or did they already know that you...
No, it was at the beginning. It was a constant fear that I would just get to the end of the day. I'd always wait for someone to say "à demain," because whenever they said "tu peux y aller," I was like, "Oh shit!" Like, as in you can go. Like, come on, we've had a laugh, but off. But when they were like "à demain," I was like, yes. And I never had a contract for ages, so I was never really sure like what the deal was. I didn't know how to ask for a contract because that would have required like quite complex phrase construction, which I wasn't able to do. And because you had to go knock on the door, and I didn't know how to say like, excuse, can I, what's the deal? Am I employed or not? And so there was always this sense of like temporariness about the whole job. But it was quite exciting at the same time, because you're just like, well, I'm in it. I'm just going to keep going, keep pushing through. And yeah, eventually, like I did get a contract, but I didn't have like a health insurance number and stuff. And I remember I just received it, and it said like 0000X. I was like, okay, cool. So. Guess that's where my taxes are going. Turned out I wasn't paying taxes. I found out years later. These were social charges. Someone explained to me.
There's actually a couple of gentlemen outside that want to have a word with you about that.
We still have the back door.
Short while. And so as a runner, you're working in parts of the restaurant that most people probably aren't going to see.
Yeah.
And you describe at one point in terms of the underworld, of hell, of the kind of bowels of the restaurant. Can you give us a flavour of what people don't see?
Yeah, what I was struck by, and I think it's quite often the case in Parisian restaurants, is the sort of verticality of the restaurant, the physical verticality of a restaurant. And often you'll go down towards the toilets and you'll see the kitchens. So there was this whole thing of like you were up, especially in summer, you were up outside of these sort of glamorous, beautiful people eating, and then you'd go through that swinging door at the background, and it would change in an instant. You're separated. You could be sitting here eating, but behind this wall is, I describe it as like kind of hell. There are people screaming at each other. Like I learned a lot of swear words very quickly in a lot of languages, and that was really confusing to go back to the language thing. Like I was convinced. I'd note down words and be like, oh well, this was weird. And I asked French people, and they said, this is not French. And I'm like, it is, because all the waiters use it. And it turned out to be like a Tamil swear word or something. And so you're sort of picking all this stuff up. But it's it's incredible, because in a dining room, it's very calm and quiet, and everyone's eating, and you can hear a bit of chit-chat and stuff. But on the other side of the door, it's hell, it's carnage, and it's like pure hatred almost of people.
Yeah.
But we're all bringing out the plates and being like...
Yeah. A lot of the action here, and in many ways, the kind of the fulcrum of this novel kind of revolves around a place called the Pass, which sounds like a god-awful place, Edward.
Yeah, it's a tiny place. I mean, it's the Pass is where all the food comes out, basically. You can imagine it with this sort of heat lamps, this sort of red heat lamps. That's very sort of like visual in terms of like your idea that this is the gateway to hell. And this is like manned by these three Tamil guys, and that's kind of the clash of the two worlds. Like the waiters coming in, and then down somewhere below are these like emaciated chefs who are just like living off cigarettes basically and heat. And you're just like screaming, and people screaming into interphones and stuff. Like, where's this? Stealing plates, pushing, budging. Because it turns out, like, we were talking about this earlier, but the kitchen, I think, in literature is a quite glamorous place almost. It's that Bourdain thing of like the sort of pirate crew. Whereas the waiters, like, you were a kind of gang, but it was a very solitary endeavor. Like, it's you working for your tips, for your table, and shifts would overlap, so you didn't have this sense of all arriving at one point and preparing and all like leaving at the same time. So you were kind of with each other but against each other. Like the next person, the next waiter he was potentially stealing tips from you or plates often to serve his own orders. So you couldn't really trust anybody.
Yeah.
Especially me, because I was English, which I heard a lot.
Well, yeah, like the Englishness, and I can ask this as a Welshman. Your Englishness. To what extent was that something that you relied on or became a kind of signifier of who you were in this world? And I want to come to the language in a moment as well, and what it means to kind of learn a language in this environment. But because you throughout the book you're
well, yeah, I just
became
the English guy, l'anglais. I didn't have a name. I was actually stripped back to my which is funny because you don't necessarily see yourself an English person when you're in England, and then you arrive in a foreign country and they're like, you're the English guy, and that's it. You just become the English guy. So I was all the cliches rolled up into one. And what I had to quickly do was like learn about the royal family. I realized because everybody would ask me questions about the royal family. Like the most like hardcore waiter with like tattoos, he's like smoking, quite aggressive. He's like, "Eh tiens," and I'm like, "Yeah, what?" He's like, "Elle a combien de enfants, la reine?" I'm like, Andrew, Charles, like 3. He's like, "No, mate." And you have these like crazy discussions with people at the royal family. So that's kind of the stuff you have to play up to being an Englishman almost. That I'd never had an interest in the royal family until now. Now I'm passionate about the royal family, obviously.
And around this kind of this world of the past, you've got, yes, it's a French restaurant, a very French restaurant serving, French classics, and yet the people that are working there are representative of kind of nationalities from the world over, right? So you've got
particularly in the kitchens, of course. Everybody was black in the kitchens, like. Whether they were African or French African, I never knew because we didn't spend much time with them. So all the food's being prepared by people who were non-French, I guess you could say. And then in terms of who's serving it, there was a mixture of people. Like half of the waiting staff were probably kind of French. The other half, Portuguese, North African, this English guy. Like it was a good mixture of people, which is funny because they're sort of, we're literally serving an idea of France, I guess, in these very traditional dishes. Which is something I never really got. I can't really answer. I don't think I have the answer to. What does it mean to be French, or what is French cuisine?
There's this glorious moment,
isn't there? I guess.
Yeah, there's this glorious moment for me when these two vieux pétainistes, who are dining in these restaurants. These old kind of these old French political kind of racists, effectively, and kind of in love with the whole kind of this lost idea of France, and the people in the restaurant don't want to serve them.
Yeah, completely. I actually wondered whether they should put this in because it was, some people get really attached by this idea, like because I put these two racist characters in, that all French people are racist. The Daily Mail kind of loves this stuff, but yes. And the funny thing was they asked to be served by somebody different who was like white in this anecdote or this event, and the irony is obviously their food had been prepared, and Orwell says this as well, like the more you pay for your food, the more people have touched it, is essentially the one thing you can be sure of. And it's true because so many people touch the food, including the waiters. We can go into that later. Hopefully you've all eaten already, because don't want to ruin your meal. But so they were like, oh, can we have someone different and stuff? And there was this whole standoff, and none of the staff would serve them. And then the manager, obviously decided that he would serve them. And so they are still buying into the illusion that the restaurant's serving, that the dining room is this kind of very French place, when actually, if you do look down into the kitchens, you get a very different picture.
There's a line in it, it's like, the food is prepared by somebody from Burkina Faso, then handled by the Tamils, and then served up by Portuguese,
No one with a French passport's touched the food until it got to his mouth. And everyone's touched it by that point as well. On purpose.
I just want to unpack the language thing a little bit as well, because I think, learning languages or not speaking a language or feeling like you're not in full command of the language is something that kind of resonates, I think, often with a lot of people in this room. And it's, it's kind of incredible the learning a language in a hostile environment, or learning a language in an environment when you are, in 5 ways a foreigner. How do you go about trying to I remember the first time when as an 18-year-old I had to go and present myself at the college I was teaching at and knock on the door and meet the headmaster, right? And it was like that moment, and it's still the most terrifying thing I've ever done. It seems like you were doing that jump every single day.
Yeah, it was awful. And the worst was when I was eventually serving tables, because you were just terrified they go off script, which obviously is normal because they're French people. They just assumed you spoke French. And so, it was awful. So at the beginning, your people think you're really stupid. I mean, I probably am quite stupid, but like, people would speak at you as they would speak at a 4 or 5-year-old, but I couldn't even respond like a 4 or 5-year-old. I'd be like, oui. And then in my mind, I'm like, and then anything like present tense, like anything that was like past tense, I could kind of get that eventually. So it's like little by little, you're just sort of like, you'd run and you'd write stuff like reflexive verbs and stuff. That was always a nightmare, and you're like, je suis, whatever, like fine. And they do a thing, and you could tell when people don't understand you, because their head goes from like vertical to like this, and the further over it goes, the more you know you've lost them. And it just becomes like a noise. You're like, because you're hearing people speaking all day, and so you think you've got it, and you're like, I've got this, I'll just say this, and you're like, and they're like, what? You're like, I'll try a different way. No. So it was brutal, and that was what was interesting when I came to writing the book, is that I think because I couldn't, and I'm quite sociable, I quite like talking to people. So being in an environment where I couldn't express myself or talk with people obviously meant that I suddenly become just like a receptor. I was like a passive entity. And so I think that's what made everything, as well as the fact that I was in this completely new, novel environment, everything I was experiencing was so potent, whether it was like sight, smells, language, and I was very like acutely trying to listen to people, to dialogue all the time, just like trying to pick up on dialogue. So I think that it was good from a like learning to write perspective, because you learn how people speak. Obviously, all the people around you think you've got learning difficulties, but eventually, I think that also made them drop their guard a little bit with me. They didn't see me as a threat or a menace. They saw me as like a perfidious Englishman. As one guy told me, he was like the great-great-great-grandson of Napoleon, all this kind of stuff. And I don't know what you meant to say to that. I'm like, okay.
Just nod.
Just like, good, yes. Funnily enough, yeah, Wellington. So like, it's just, sorry, I can't remember what the question was. So I'm sort of
no,
off.
it was about the challenges. It was about the challenges of kind of learning the language.
And you get small victories sometimes, and you're like, yes, they understood me, or whatever. Yeah. And then obviously later I sort of turned it on its head, and I would pretend to be, when I was dealing with foreign like diners, I would pretend to be French and speak English. Yeah. So I'd use their bad English as a way of making, because I found when I spoke English as an English person, I get no reaction. I thought it'd be quite weird to be served by an English guy, and they'd be like, hello, and I'm hi. And they just order. So, and you never get a tip, because they're like, this is not exotic, this is not in France. Whereas if I was like, hello, maybe you've made your choice? And they're like, this guy, this is Paris.
I don't think you're alone in pretending to be French to overseas tourists sometimes. I've done it. Yeah.
Is this way, I think, the metro, yes.
I wouldn't know what you're talking about. But can we talk about the characters? Because there were some wonderfully drawn characters in this book. There's some really memorable people that you worked with. And I don't want to talk about their reality or not for the time being. We'll come to that in a moment. But who stays with you the most? Who do you still think about?
Well, actually, almost on a general answer to that is that what's been incredible with the like feedback from the book is that these characters who are like intensely personal and very much based on real people have weirdly turned out to be almost archetypes of people who work in a restaurant. So I'll get people who write to me who worked in, I don't know, a restaurant in Rome in the 80s or in New York in the 90s, and they'll be like, I work with these people. But they have the same nicknames sometimes. And then I'm like, and then I wonder, like, is it me? Am I remembering? But I don't know if it's the environment, but it does draw in these people. But so there are some like key characters, obviously. I think the sommelier was a very important character, and Lucien, who's the kind of the guide to the restaurant for me, and he was, he's like a sort of 3rd or 4th generation Parisian waiter, and it was quite funny going around with him. because you go to all the restaurants and all the like waiters all knew each other, and you felt like you were in a gang, as sort of like Goodfellas, without the music and drugs and money, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, there was money, but
And Lucien, of course, had Hollywood aspirations.
he did, yeah. Now, actually, I did check recently. He's an estate agent, which is less glamorous than Hollywood, but still.
I worried about him at the end of the book.
Yeah. Well, you kind of worry about all of them.
I do. I worry about you at the end of the book as well.
Yeah. Well, wait till the end of the talk.
Yeah, and the Salvatore also.
Yeah. So he gets quoted back to me a lot. The line about live where the tomatoes taste good, and so he is quite a good character, like vivacious, full of life. I don't know where he is though. I have no idea. I always wonder if I'll bump into these people, and they'll still be working as waiters or somewhere else. It's a sort of eternal question. Yeah. Or here picketing, being, how dare you ruin my life?
Well, actually,
the
got
a surprise guest.
Yeah.
Bring him out.
Yeah.
Oh, fuck.
That would be wonderful.
Oh, sorry about that.
Yeah, yeah. And there are female characters as well. We have Pauline and the world of the hostesses in the restaurant who kind of add a level of kind of glamour and kind of pizzazz to the whole affair.
Yeah, I mean, it is a distinctly male environment in these places. And I remember at one point a discussion with the editor, they were like, where are the women? I was like, well, they're not often there. And it's funny, I read an article, I think it was an interview with one of the managers at Le Deux Magots or something, and they were saying that they just didn't employ women as waiters because they had this kind of like received wisdom that they couldn't carry like heavy stuff, basically. It's like, and so there's this whole thing about, because it is a very intensely physical job, I guess, and I think historically it's been a male occupation. So the whole like waiting staff were predominantly men. There were some girls, and there are some girls in the book, and you see it more and more often. I think in these bigger places, often it's still quite masculine. Kitchens, there was not a girl in sight. I mean, yeah, you wouldn't want to go down there as a girl, I don't think.
The burning question that I have, and I'm sure anybody who's already kind of read this book, is: are you still in touch with anybody from the restaurant period? And if you don't want to answer that, the question could be, how would they have responded if they were able to read this book?
So this is a thing I not struggled with, but I think when you're writing about people without asking them as well,
without their consent,
years after the fact, you do feel an intense responsibility towards them, even towards the city, even towards the restaurant. I knew I had to be like judicial in my choice of anecdotes. So we talk about the racist couple, but I also wanted to make sure it was balanced the whole way through, because otherwise it could easily veer into something like, we said like Daily Mail kind of piece, like hating on Paris, which is what I wanted to do. And same with the people. You're dealing with real people. Then obviously you have to go through the art of like disguising them a little bit physically, or merging some characters to try and also protect them as people, I guess. And so, yeah, I'm not in contact with anybody. Well, actually, I did bump into one of them, the girl, Camille, last year. And when I said, like, oh...
When you say bump into?
You literally physically.
Okay, wow.
Yeah, in Provence, of all places.
Camille's a love interest.
Love interest.
Okay, so let's,
So she thought I was joking.
I'm gasping here.
Yeah,
okay,
I know, exactly.
Yeah.
This is the second one, still waiting.
Yeah.
And so I was like, oh, well, kind of an awkward thing to say, something I haven't seen for about 10 years. Like, we're in a book, you're kind of in it. And she's like, I was like, yeah, check your email.
Yeah.
So yeah, and she's actually read the book, so she's one of the people I have been in contact with.
Okay.
I'm quite happy with, yeah. Hasn't blocked me since.
Okay.
Hasn't replied.
Okay.
No, so I haven't seen them. But then the book hasn't been published in French, which I guess is probably one of the reasons why I haven't been contacted by these waiters.
Or lawyers. Yeah. I guess I'm interested as well in and you've mentioned it as well, the kind of novelistic kind of process of writing a book such as this. You've kind of mentioned a certain amount of amalgamation and a certain amount of creative license. I guess I'm interested in a little bit about that, and I'm also interested in, you weren't writing when you were working, because you were doing 14-hour day shifts and physically exhausted. So you were writing at a period of remove. How did it feel to kind of go back and revisit those days? And then how does it feel now to kind of be
still
to be
dining
doing,
out on
yeah.
it. Yeah,
To
exactly.
be flogging that horse.
Yeah. No, I'm happy to be here. Yeah, it was. So I hadn't gone explicitly to write. I wasn't there in a documentary, sort of like, I wasn't there taking notes and purposely trying to sort of capture the whole thing. But I was taking notes of things and writing down snippets of conversation, all in the sort of aim, I guess, of getting better at French, but also getting better at writing. But then obviously, this is now years later, and we already know, like, when we recall memories, they change slightly based on who we are at the time of recollection, so they can be more positive and negative. And so I think that definitely is infused in the book, and it's one of the hard parts of revisiting, I think, memoir writing in itself, because and I did feel quite, like, uneasy about it, because you're moving stuff around in chronological terms, because you want to make a narrative structure that works. And at the end, I was like, is this, how far away? Because I wanted to be very truthful, because probably won't talk about that, but it's got a bit of a social, political message about it as well. So whenever I moved stuff, a small part of me was like, is this undermining what I'm trying to do or what I'm trying to say? At the end, I resolved it by being like, well, it's the role of the writer is to bring the reader through this story. And had I just thrown all these recollections and not edited them down into a manuscript, I don't think anyone would have read it at all, and therefore it would have been a failure as a project. So the fact that you have to change it is, I think, the writer's responsibility, and so I'm happy with that now. Even though, like, there's some sort of accordion-like time. So, you have a lot of events that might happen at the beginning and less so in the middle and at the end, but you sort of restructure them, and hopefully it reads well, I guess.
Yeah, it absolutely does.
Definitely.
Yeah, no, I'm more than happy to kind of say that. I'm wondering if now would be a good moment to kind of ask you to read a little, because we've heard a lot about the book. We haven't actually heard anything.
We can do some reading
from the book. Yeah, I was kind of wondering if maybe the piece that we kind of mentioned before.
Pretend this is all there.
Yeah, way up until somewhere around here, kind of
from there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Should you introduce or?
Well, I mean.
Yeah, no. So I guess this is just this is a piece from the middle of the book, which is just about which is a kind of quite a cynical reflection on the Paris restaurant industry.
Yeah, I think by this point, so there's sort of at the beginning, obviously it was all quite fun and exciting, and I was completely lost. But there was something romantic about it. Like, I was always reminded that, like, people like Orwell and stuff had done this. But by the midpoint, I realized I was now stuck doing this, and I couldn't get a job anywhere else because I was trying. And I was, as I say here. Also, sorry, my voice is like 5 octaves lower than usual. I was a bit ill last week, so I'm not putting it on. So I feel a rising resentment of the restaurant's approach to gastronomy, yet I increasingly admire the waiters, the pride in what they do, their no-nonsense work ethic, the Sisyphean nature of the job, redemption through repetition, the camaraderie, the competition, their relationship with money and the ephemeral, the way they feel part of a great lineage of something distinctly French, that they, unlike the rest of the citizens of the city, know something special. A secret order of magicians, perhaps, just a lot less glamorous. Because if a waiter is doing his job correctly, he'll be manipulating your perception of reality. He is, to all intents and purposes, an illusionist, and his job is to deceive you. He wants you to believe that all is calm and luxurious, because on the other side of the wall, beyond that door, is hell. He is, in effect, the living example of the facade. The management are always in a high state of anxiety because for the restaurant to fulfill its role and provide the illusion of luxury that everyone in the dining room expects, the innards must come out of the darkness, across the thin divide and into the world of the living. This puts the restaurant at its most exposed. Everything else happens out of sight. It suffices to allude to the chef, and the diner will paint the picture themselves, which doubtless will not include a dozen emaciated immigrants being barked at by stressed Tamils or a scimitar-wielding Corsican. The waiters are the weak point in this chain, emissaries from the underworld sent out like yo-yos on the understanding that they will return, and in the meantime play their role and perpetuate the illusion. But a waiter isn't a soldier. As we know, he is a bounty hunter, and the restaurant pays him enough to ensure he can live his itinerant existence, but never enough for him to escape definitively. So he steals and cheats and charms his way to whatever he can get. And this is why you pay him a tip. It's a tax given on the understanding that he'll perform his role to the best of his abilities as an actor, bounty hunter, stage manager, bully, and everything else you want him to be so that your food arrives just as you'd expected it. You are paying him so that you get better service than the other tables. So don't think the world behind that door has nothing to do with you. Just like us, you are complicit. Running a restaurant is an exercise in driving down costs while serving the outcome with a straight face. And in Paris, just as in other cities, towns and villages, this is being entrusted to a group of delinquents, men who, for whatever reason, have fallen into the waiting game.
Thank you very much. Where does that voice come from? Is that the disaffected waiter, Ed Chisholm, or is that the slightly more...
Yeah, I think that's the more cynical me by that point. I think I sort of run down by I think there's a lot of injustice in that world. And once the sheen had rubbed off, and you are being, it's brutal, the hours are brutal, the way you're treated is awful. And often, I mean, so I wasn't obviously, I was at that point allowed to be in Europe. So there are people there without papers and stuff, and I guess it's even more complicated. But I think it preys on, it's a very itinerant world, and it preys on people who arrive and probably don't know what their rights are so much. It's easy to just keep them working and stuff. And so these people are in quite precarious situations. And so when you realize that, and then as a waiter, I think it's a little bit like working in a call center. Like most of the exchanges you have with people are negative. Like people rarely talk to a waiter unless they have a problem. And when they do have a problem, they really aren't happy with you. And you think like, all these people have been on their feet since 6 a.m. They haven't stopped for a break. You haven't eaten. And you're like, what is it all for? I think that was my thinking. Like, why?
Yeah.
What are we doing this for? The food wasn't that good, you know.
Yeah, and the one thing you don't learn about in this book is the food, right? And there's barely any eating. There's
a distinct lack of eating.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In this book,
bread.
I guess there's a distinct lack of eating, but there's a lot of politics, but kind of implicit politics. And I guess when did that political awakening for you kind of come? Did it come whilst you were working, or did it come with a reflection afterwards when you're like, hang on, I've been exploited here, or was it?
Yeah, it definitely happened while I was there, and I think I was you're kind of aware of it, and then I had one need, which was to have a job and get paid. So I was like, whatever, I'll do this, and then I need to keep my job. So I'm scared of losing my job, so I'll do whatever they ask me to. I was quite a sadistic manager as well, who'd taken a very deep dislike to me from the beginning. And he would sometimes he'd send me off to go and, his boyfriend was a manager in another restaurant, and he'd send me off like this kind of plaything to his boyfriend could ask me to do all these horrible jobs. I never knew what time I was leaving and what time I was going, and so I remember just thinking this is horrible. And then you start to speak to other people, and you see how they're treated, and there's people with children or who are working their asses off and generally terrified of losing their job, and they've been doing it for years. And you're like, wow, this is this is our everyday existence. I mean, I'm temporarily there, but this isn't right. Yeah, how these people are being treated.
And I think it's fair to say that you're certainly very aware, and you say this in the book, that you are writing from a white middle class English existence, and you've always got an out at the end of this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I knew the reason I got the job as well. Was because I was a white, blonde guy, basically. That was the only, you could see it in his eyes. Whereas the other guys who turned up wouldn't have had that. I mean, don't get me wrong. When I was there, I did think am I ever going? This is it. I'm going to wait it for the rest of my life. Because the longer you spend doing it, you're like, wow, the CV is just a big line of waiting jobs. But it's and that was sort of the working title was The Waiting Game, because a lot of people end up just sort of waiting. They're there waiting for their lives to start, and often they get sort of trapped in it a little bit, and it's easy. I think it's something that's quite universal. We have ambitions or images of what we'd like to be doing when we're older. I don't know what that means now. And then we end up doing these other little jobs. We make compromises, and we say, oh, I'll take that job, maybe this. And then years down the line, that's what we're doing. We're kind of defined by it. And so, I mean, very rarely amongst the people I was working with, did you meet people like, yeah, I wanted to be a waiter. There were a couple, and they used to be much more of a career job. But very few people wanted to do it. For most people, it's a temporary job that had become a permanent job, which for me was interesting to write about as well, because I think that reflects something much wider and something a lot of people, even in office jobs, live, whether it's marketing or whatever.
I think it would be amiss of us, certainly amiss of me as a literature professor, to kind of not talk about the kind of literary models or at least the backdrop against which this book exists. You know, we've mentioned, you know, the elephant in the room we haven't really mentioned today is George Orwell.
Yep.
I found myself consistently drawn to, you know, Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential when I was reading this, but in a kind of slightly different way. How do you situate your own kind of work, you know, against these?
Yeah, I didn't. So I never. It's funny because when I said I could write the book, which was funny because the agent had said like, okay, these chapters are great. Can you write a book? And I was like, yeah, definitely, no problem. Then I went home and I was like, whoa, okay, how do I? Because I never really read non-fiction books or I'd never read memoirs. And my obsession, and still is like novel writing and fiction writing. So my approach to writing the book was almost like novelistic, I guess. Yeah, so I think stylistically it sits more in a novel in its reading, even if the material is memoir and non-fiction. Who influenced me? There's so many people. I was reading a lot of James Salter at the beginning of. I've always have, but I remember I was reading quite a lot of times. I was very distilling sentences down to sort of almost like a poetic simplicity was something I was trying to do. Whether I achieved it or not, don't tell me. But I don't think it's always good to have ambition. And then obviously I think when you arrive in Paris, you go through a bit of a cliched period of reading like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway and things and imitating or aping these people quite badly. There was a good book called Memoirs of Montparnasse by a Canadian writer. What was his name? I remember. Anybody? It's a test. Terrible.
It'll come to us. It'll come to us.
So that was something as well. And he was like a young Canadian guy who'd ended up in Paris and sort of talks about his time living in Montparnasse. So I think those were the kind of books. But then that was like, this was like, years had elapsed since I'd arrived in Paris. So then it was just like all my reading. In terms of like French writers, I think Zola was somebody who was quite influential in that kind of like super realism, detailed, try and capture like exactly what's going on in life. And almost, I wanted to act as a kind of, what they call like time box you put in the ground, and you sort of open it and be like, this is a very particular period of time, and this captures the essence of like what it was like in Paris at that time. Not the Paris like we know as tourists, but the Paris like just a bit outside of the centre, physically and also narratively, I guess.
Yeah, because this is a book that doesn't only talk about, you know, a certain kind of, you know, square mile in the middle of Paris. You know, you talk about a flea pit hotel. You have a wonderfully prescient encounter with bed bugs.
Yeah, I was like patient zero on the bed bugs. Yeah.
Absolutely. If anybody needs any bed bug tips, Edward Chisholm is probably
everything.
not your man. Yeah.
Burn it all. Yeah. It's funny because that was something and people are like, oh, really? And then that's obviously become a big thing, as well as the ready-made meals sort of scandal that sort of rocked France, and the English really liked it at one point.
How has seeing how a kind of big, major, dare I say, flagship restaurant works from the inside, from the bowel up, essentially. Yeah. How has that exchanged your, and again, apologies to anybody who has restaurant reservations for later in the evening, how has it changed your experience with dining in Paris or dining anywhere?
Yeah. I think, it's more universal. I do have a real problem when I go in these big places because I know you're being, what's the word? Scammed, basically. Because I can sense how artificial the whole thing is, and I don't know, I just feel cheated a little bit. I'm like, you're coming into a restaurant to exchange money. Exchange food would be a weird concept. So exchange money for food, and so you're kind of expecting when you've ordered, I don't know, whatever it is, le blanquette de veau, that it is like made with, or at least like veal and whatever else it is. But often when you really see what's happening and it's made in like a factory or someone else, I don't know. I'm like, why would you open a restaurant if you just want to serve food that's been made somewhere else and is now cooked in a microwave? That really annoys me, I think. It's difficult, so I can't go when I'm in this place. Like, I hate myself. I'm like, come on.
Are there any tricks or secret code words that a diner should know? Masonic handshakes.
Yeah, so you scratch it. No. So the key to finding a good restaurant is the toilets. If the toilets are clean and they've got like nice napkins, paper towels, then you know everything else is good. I think that's the key. But then obviously all the usual stuff like small menu, can you see in the kitchen, staff that don't look like they've been like worked to their bones for the last 12 hours. But like handwritten menu, small kitchen. If you can see in the kitchen, that's even better.
always have a nose in the toilets
Yeah.
and the kitchen
It's like,
before.
you want to go and check out
yeah.
the toilets and then give your waiter a tip first. I think that would be the way to do it. Because if you give them a tip, you're guaranteed good service. Whereas if you give it at the end, it's a bit late, isn't it? I've never done it, and I think it'd be quite ballsy to do it.
I remember there was this really passive-aggressive thing that was shared on social media during the pandemic. And this was particularly in America, where there's a completely different tipping culture. But somebody would sit down at the start of a meal and would put like $60 down at the start of a meal. And then for everything that the waiter did wrong, they would take some money away. And I find that a wonderful way of motivating
But
people.
that's funny, because that's as a waiter how you visualize it. Like every mistake, you're just like, oh, no, this is going down and down. So in a sense, I guess it's just honest, but horrible, right?
Yeah.
Imagine. God.
Don't do that, but try it.
No.
Yeah.
It might work.
Yeah.
Look what you could have.
Yeah. I think very soon we'll be opening up the floor for questions. So please, kind of, if you have any burning Paris restaurant questions, then kind of get them at the ready. I think there's kind of one more kind of question that I want to ask before we get into it. This is the one where I bury you, Chisholm. No, I guess this is we've touched on the fact that this is a political novel, and this is a novel that is a novel of, in many ways, a kind of a growing political kind of awareness. But this is also a novel about France, and I think we've been talking in relatively general terms about restaurants so far. But actually, this is a novel that I think gave you an education into not only the restaurant world, but to France and French society. And I guess my question is, what did you learn about France?
Thank you for asking that. You have to buy the book. I think, how long have we got? I think it's easy to like buy into the cliches of anywhere you go initially. So it's easy to be like, the French are, whatever they are, well dressed, and the women are elegant, and all this kind of stuff, and they eat very well. And all Parisians wear scarves even in summer and this kind of stuff. That is kind of true. But like, actually, when you do push through that swinging door at the back of the restaurant, and that is just a facade. That's one version of Paris. And I think everyone has that kind of imagined. I mean, Paris is the great city of the imagination. I think we all have a version of Paris which is probably detached from the reality. But to go like, to encounter like I guess you could call them the real Parisians. I don't know. That's a bit naff. Maybe I use that for the documentary later. But like, you realize like actually like all these cities, it's a very, very complex organism of people and connections between all these different parts of the world. And I think the restaurant puts it at its most stark, because in your day-to-day life, you're probably not encountering these people. On the metro a little bit, you'll see them, the tired, worn-out Tamil guys, or the like, plongeur who's, from Eritrea and just finished like 12-hour shift. But you don't really have much contact with them. But the restaurant suddenly is this tiny, small version of France, actually. I mean, because Paris, you find the whole of France. So suddenly you've got everybody there, from the politician, the lawmaker sitting at the top, to the guy at the bottom who doesn't have any papers and isn't legally allowed to be there. So it taught me to understand the nuance and the subtlety of France. It also taught me that it's a very, like England, when you leave England, it's a very class-obsessed society. It still is. And in France, you kind of think, well, maybe that's gone because they, cut off people's heads and this kind of thing. But actually, it's still a very vertical class society as well. It's not a criticism of any French people here. Like, it's fine. I'll leave by the back door. But I think it's still a very class-based society. It's still it's an unjust society, like most societies, I guess. But there's also, it's not black and white. It's very nuanced. Like, it's not a racist society. It's a society where you can still come and you can still become. This idea of being a citizen and joining France still exists, and you can become a French person, whatever that means. And I think that's something positive.
And I'm not going to spoil the end of the book, but I think there's a wonderful moment of collective joy towards the end of this book, and it's a surprising moment. They don't quite cut the head off the director of the restaurant, but there is this kind of wonderful kind of moment of kind of solidarity, and it's kind of, there is a kind of, there is hope in this book as well.
This is when the waiter spring me from jail at the end, right?
Well, exactly.
There is hope in it, and I wanted it to make sure it wasn't too much of a negative book. So good Christmas gift.
Perhaps not hope for the restaurant industry.
I'd like to think so. I think this is one restaurant. It's kind of the restaurant, and a lot of there's a lot of places which are doing good things. So if there's any restaurant owners looking to throttle me, it's not like there are many places doing lots of good stuff, and so I think that's where the hope is, and it's up to us actually as diners, as patrons of these places, to patronize these institutions, these establishments, because by doing that we'll like facilitate basically better working conditions for people, and we'll eat better. And it's a long chain as well. Like if you're eating in a restaurant that cares about sort of local and seasonally grown food, that goes all the way back to the person growing it, you know, on a sort of human level as opposed to industrial level. So the book's kind of the tip of a conversation, I think, which I don't have the means to answer, about our whole relationship with food, which I think is something important today.